My role, as Dr. John has just said, is on the business development, marketing and communication of what we do. So my responsibility is to understand kind of what we do and why we do it, more than the fine detail of exactly how we do it. So if there are any questions on that, then hopefully there's a slide there. I've put my email up here, so if there's questions which I'm incapable of answering today, then anyone wants to ping me an email, I can get an answer straight back to you, time differences permitting across the globe. So the revised plan for today is still to go through the presentation, but a revised form of the presentation which you have in your documentation, which is the paper from Darren and John Winchester, and looking at some of the latest developments on CFD. But more what we refer to as high-resolution advanced CFD. Maybe not some of the grades of CFD that you might have seen so far. So a very quick background about us. I'll just skim over this, but we've been around since 2003. Our background is very much motorsport. Still is our core main plank of our business. And about 2008, we made the move into architectural CFD. Although still continuing with motorsport and other sectors. We're about 115 people, so we're not a big organisation, but a very high percentage of those are engineers, fluid dynamicists, aerodynamicists, and so on. So objective today is to try to demonstrate how the CFD we've developed and the skills we developed in facing aerodynamic challenges for motorsport actually are relevant to the topic of the conference and creating a sustainable virtual urban. So very quickly, a little bit of explanation about the traditional design process. I mean, obviously this is motorsport, but the process is relevant. The process is the same, and you'll obviously recognise it. And the way this works, if the pointer works, is that we have our little Einsteins over here with their bright ideas. They generate these ideas, and this is back in 2003. And those would be tested on a scale model such as this. In motorsport, we use a 60% model because we think anything smaller doesn't give us accurate data. Just as an instance, if you did 60% of Burj Khalifa, I think it'd still be about 495 metres tall. So a bit of a problem getting it in a tunnel. And obviously in architecture, you tend to use about, as Kevin said earlier, about 1/250th. And at that, I think Burj Khalifa is still about 3.3 metres tall, so it's still quite a problem for us. So they develop their ideas. It goes round that loop a few times, and then eventually down into a drawing office, into manufacture, and out to a track test. And that either does or it doesn't work, in which if it doesn't, it goes back to the engineers, and they say, oh, the problem is we should have done a full-scale test. So we then go to a full-scale wind tunnel, even more expensive over in Indianapolis probably, and then through the loop and eventually back on the car, and away you go. This is it's not a sustainable process. It's very time-consuming, it's very expensive, and it's not completely accurate. Just as an example, back in 2003, when we stopped doing this, a scale model test would cost about $50,000 a day, full scale about $100,000 a day, and on the track, which is the most expensive and probably the least accurate, about $300,000 a day. So obviously it's not sustainable, and which is one of the reasons now why in Formula One you're not allowed to go track testing because the small teams can't afford it. So we designed or developed a new process. We call it designing in the digital domain. So we still have our Einsteins with their bright ideas, but now all their developments are created and developed in the virtual world through some very high-power computer background and setup. It also gives them high speed. So as an example, back in 2003, we'd expect engineers to make maybe 2, maybe 3 innovations per week. Now it's more like 15 or 16. So obviously there's quite a lot of advantages there in timescales, turnaround, and productivity. But the designs here from the virtual world are then tested in a simulator. It's a bit like a flight simulator. It's called a DIL, driver in the loop. So the driver actually sitting in that thing, driving it, he's driving his virtual car. So that's a real test, and that information fed back, and again back to the loop, drawing office, manufacturer, and on the circuit. We no longer go to the full scale, we don't touch the wind tunnel. And in fact, most of our major clients now, people like Indy cars and the Indy 500, Le Mans cars, that sort of stuff, they go straight onto the circuit. They don't even test it because they've now come to test our results. So it does actually work. So that's the process we adopted. So that's all very interesting, but how is that relevant to what we do now in terms of creating buildings? So how do we apply these techniques to studying the high winds around tall and super tall buildings, or pedestrian comfort, or natural ventilation, or the effect of geography and topography around buildings? And how do we actually use gatherings such as this to combine our knowledge with those of people like RWDI and these other organisations who've been doing it for years to come out with better ideas and better solutions to create a better idea, a better environment. One thing you do need on high resolution CFD to drive it, one of the critical factors is you have to have massive computing power. So as an example, I'm going to detail because it's not very exciting, but anyway, our system has about 4,500 cores across 5 racks and a processing power of just short of 50 teraflops. And it's resolving 12 individual, separate, simultaneous solutions with over 1 billion cells in each at the same time in a matter of hours. And that facility allows us to model complete cityscapes of 10 or 12 or 15 kilometre diameter, right down to the very fine detail of maybe a natural ventilation inlet vein, looking at fine detail. That starts to show you what I mean by high resolution as against low resolution. And I put this slide in here this morning, mainly for Kevin's benefit, actually. Do it again. Because I know he had a particular interest in rear diffusers. But the whole point about this, although it's motorsport, was not to look at the car, really. But what CFD is showing us on here, and I won't go into detail, but actually a lot of the downforce on a car is actually created at the back end, not with air over the top, as you might think. But I don't know if you can see, but there's a little airstream just there going in that hole. That hole is actually a brake cooling duct. But actually that airstream goes in there, it comes out through its wheel, along the side, underneath and through the diffuser. So by modifying the brake cooling duct, we can change the downforce at the back of the car, which is why I used to see a lot of people mucking about with brake ducts on Formula One paddocks. So that's just an example of what the detail is actually showing us, of actually what's going on inside there, right down to that sort of detail. This is an area where some of my knowledge gets a little bit thin in terms of the physics of actually how it all works, but we'll have a go at this. This is looking at typical output of some wind tunnels of varying capacities. The green area on the left there is where a lot of wind tunnels are operating, and you can start to see that as the Reynolds number increases, the drag, the difference you're getting in the results, and likewise in Strual or ST numbers. In the yellow area is where more advanced and high-pressure wind tunnels are operating. Reynolds number getting higher again, and again, it's quite a variation in the results, showing a variation between there and where we started. And then the pink area is probably a hypercritical range of pressurized wind tunnels working with Freon in their atmosphere. And again, still the variation, but it's also significant variation from the far end of that pink zone to where the green one started. But the problem is that we're looking at high Reynolds numbers of something like tall and super tall buildings. They're over there somewhere. So that's where the high-res CFD starts to cut in. And we do work with quite a lot of wind engineers who ask us to go just a little bit further and look at some areas where they're not quite reaching. So that's where we're working at the moment. There is a problem, of course, which is that if you have high Reynolds numbers, if you haven't got the meshing correct or opportunity, then really it's a wasted opportunity. Looking at boundary layer separation, and one of our previous speakers talked about boundary layer and geometry layer and so on. This is a contrast between 3 levels of CFD, the coarse, medium, and fine. Coarse in this case is about 40 million cells, and the medium is about 60 million, and the fine here is about 80 million. And you can see instantly the start of the change you get. And this is a purely an academic study of a round cylindrical shape, so that we could do this and compare with published data to correlate and validate our CFD production. Because as Kevin said earlier, CFD is fine, but obviously you need to be able to validate it and correlate it back to published data to demonstrate that actually the results are truthful and worthwhile. If this were a real-life study, then of course the problem with real life is you don't have buildings in glorious isolation. They have neighbours and they are impacting upon each other and affecting each other. I mean, look out the window across Shanghai, a pretty good example. So this would have buildings staggered around it, and wind being blown at it from probably 16 different angles at different speeds, and probably using about 1 billion cells rather than 80 million. In looking at geometry level, I don't know if you're familiar with the CARC model. It stands for the Commonwealth Advisory Aeronautical Research Council, but it's used by quite a lot of universities. So again, consequently, there's a lot of published data on CARC. And so we ran these tests, and the number of tests, the wind tunnel tests, a lot of them have been done, one by Obazaju at 1/250th. So we ran our CFD also at 250, and I know you can see from back there the results, but effectively the results compare, and we're on stream on there. If you then blow that up to full scale, which is what we do now, rather than doing 1/250th to run it at the full scale model, you start to see the difference in information you're getting. Regardless of the numbers at the bottom of the screen, it's pretty evident that there's a lot more information being produced from that model, even at that point. And again, this is a purely academic exercise, and in real life there'd be buildings stacked around it, in front of it, alongside it, staggered, at different angles and so on. So you wouldn't have that isolated effect, but you would be able to see the difference of how they work with and against each other. This is another view of the same CARC model. In this case, what we're looking at here is how the wind, looking at this top one, on this windward side of the windward face here, the air, which is this cold air here, is coming down the front of the building, hitting the ground and going forward, and hitting the oncoming, meeting the oncoming air, and then ending up with this horseshoe vortex around the building. And so a start of looking at pedestrian comfort, it starts to indicate whereabouts we're going to get a pedestrian problem in here, and then we can obviously measure those speeds to see whether that's acceptable or not in terms of what's going on that area of the building, and then also see the turbulences and the shedding around on the rear of the building. So a lot of academic studies, probably like a lot of you, we do a lot of work for clients, and it's all under NDAs or confidentiality agreements, so we're not allowed to talk about much that we do for other people because they don't want us to talk about the good things and the bad things about their designs. So we had a challenge on that, so we started to look at some existing stuff, and this is some desktop studies we did on our own. So we took a plan of Chicago, mainly because it was accessible, and also because most people know Chicago. It's a pretty famous windy city. And try to focus on 3 main buildings, which 2 of which are actually in the photograph there, which is the Hancock and the Sears, or the Willis Tower. The Trump came along later. We then turned that into a 10-kilometre radius as far as CFD was concerned, and obviously highlighted our buildings of interest. Obviously, we've got the lake to the east, to the right of the image there, and so this obviously is Chicago, so it exists, it's been there some time, but it could be a master planning project for a proposed new city development, but in this case, it is existing. So still keeping the 10-kilometre disc, we then start to focus a bit more, and so we wanted to have a look at the Trump Tower. So this is looking at this thing within the 10-kilometre disc. So we start to look at the top of the Trump and get some more detail of what's happening at the very top of its spire. So this, again, is coming in quite close. But then you're able to then start to mesh it, and this would now go down to a mesh at this size of, the mesh size is 10 centimetres. So from a 10-kilometre disc, we're now looking at 10-centimetre intervals on the spire at the top of the building. So that's what I start to mean by sort of high-resolution, high-power CFD, when you start to go from 10 kilometres out into the zoom. And this is still contained within our 10-kilometre models. We haven't actually dropped that and gone away to something else. These buildings you probably also recognise. They're part of our target here. There's the Hancock, the Willis, and the Trump Tower. And what these, I think, quite neatly demonstrate from the same study is how you have this vortex shedding off the first 2, and obviously Trump, that doesn't occur. And that's obviously purely from the design and the mixed geometry of how that mixed up, and it removed this vortex shedding. And the speaker was talking before about this being a source of oscillation of the buildings and potential problem in terms of the need for dampers and so on. And I believe from published material, I believe that at the time of construction, the Trump was the tallest building at that time not to require mass dampers. And obviously a similar design was used although somewhat taller, for Burj Khalifa, with this mixed geometry of squares and shoulders and round columns effectively rising. And again, I think that also has no mass damper, as I'm assured. Maybe, I hope that's right. This, with any luck, there's a movie in the middle of this one, but this is a transient study. If we can get the movie to run. Nope, go back. It's in there somewhere. Let's hope it runs. But if not, what this looks at is now looking at the city from the east. And when this is running, there she goes. Really, you've got to have faith. It starts to show, unlike the CARC model, which was looking at a building in isolation, this is starting to look at a cityscape which is obviously existing and seeing how the buildings, just to keep clicking on it to repeat it, I'm afraid. Sorry, Mr. Projectionist. This starts to look at how buildings are interacting with each other. And again, this could be, it could be a very dark night in Chicago, I look at it, or it could also be a master planning project for a new city, or it could be an existing city. And back in the UK and London at the moment, the talk of a whole load of new buildings coming into London within the next number of years to house next to 1 million people in the city. And so we can see, by dropping in and taking out models of those proposed new buildings, how they will react or interact with their surroundings. Let's move on and see if we get a bit luck. So anyway, still sticking with Chicago. This is part of a Lawson plot for a pedestrian comfort study. Lawson, if you're familiar with, certainly used in the UK a lot, but it's a scale for gauging pedestrian comfort and the acceptability or the unacceptability of wind speeds according to what activity. So I know if you're walking across a car park, you can stand more wind than if you're sitting on a patio enjoying a cup of coffee. And so it measures it by this. And what this shows on this particular corner in Chicago is a red spot, which actually means that you really ought to be doing something about this. And the red speed there is speeds in excess of 7 meters per second, and the green is 5. When we showed this actually to some architects in Chicago, they actually verified that that is a very windy corner, because actually their offices are actually on that corner. And they said they can vouch for the fact that on a windy day you lose your hat. And I hope to see if this one will work. There's a movie in there somewhere. There she goes. And this shows actually why that occurs. The wind coming from the southwest, which is the prevailing wind for Chicago, is coming through. It's hitting this large building here, which is being deflected up across this corner and through that funnel. So it's the wind from the southwest, and that building deflecting is actually causing that to come up there. The wind then hits this open area, and that allows the wind to dissipate, and so while the wind sort of decreases and the effect is diminished as it goes further up the street. That's the same thing from obviously a different angle. But that's obviously that can start to show us actually why that's occurring in there. And that again could be done at planned stage rather than existing stage. This is also a study of pedestrian comfort, an existing building. And it's not fair to be critical about the building because it was, I think, originally designed in 1973, so CFD and the likes were a bit scarce then. But clearly what's happening here is that this is the Willis Building, and the wind is actually hitting at this high level, coming down, shedding down the building, hitting the ground, and is actually bouncing off this building here. So we've got a problem in this area. And so this access vestibule lobby area was added at a later date to protect that main area, that main entrance from that downward wind. That clearly shows what's going on. And again, this could be a design stage activity. The area on the right there is showing the wind funneling at higher up on the same building, with the fin about 120 meters off the ground. This is another aspect that we're looking at. This is actually pollutant dispersal. But it could be that you're going to cite a factory unit or something which is likely to, again, hopefully we can get the movie to rerun. You can just click in the middle there, or go back and click onto it again. Maybe I can do that from here. What happens if I go back? Has he got control? And if I go forward. So with that blue area down there, talk quick as it's still on the screen because it might go off again. What that shows is actually how quickly a pollutant or contamination would spread across the city. I'll try it from here. I'll go backwards again, see if we can get it to run a bit longer. Sorry about this. This is in timescale. So what this shows is that if you're a city planner then you can know which areas of the city you're going to need to shut down first. If you've got a release of maybe a noxious gas, who knows these days, could be a terrorist with some horrible nerve gas or something, or it could just be a site of exhaust fumes. But at least then you know now exactly where, according to wind direction, which areas of the city you have to shut down first. This is going back to Kevin's topic on natural ventilation, and this is actually showing how this actually was a real study in an art gallery in London, showing how the natural ventilation comes in and is split and divided by the room dividers they put in, which would actually hang artworks on those. And again, I think we might have to do the same thing. I might have to go backwards and forwards on something again. And so those room dividers are splitting the air, and what it's showing is actually how the air circulates and through which chimneys it is then, or which extractors it is then going out. It's both in like sort of a 3D view and a plan view. And we also ran that according to the occupation of the art gallery in terms of how many people, because obviously you're going to get crowding. Down here you've got the Mona Lisa, you're going to get more crowds than if up there you've got one of my bits of artwork, you won't get anybody. But you need to judge it accordingly. Wind-driven rain, we touched on, and this is actually a topic. This doesn't show it very well, but just as a reminder, we're now running studies onto wind-driven rain for shops, offices, hotels, etc., all these sort of lobby areas, but also running concurrent studies to showing what's happening on the outside and what's happening on the inside, and also with just wind itself. So when you open the front doors to a hotel, does the reception get blown out the back door? That will cover that area as well. So quickly, I'm sort of gabbling now because I'm running out of time. But so these are some of the areas that now with high-res CFD we're looking at. Those we cover. We've got external flows, building inlets on natural ventilation. The top image there is actually a building in Kuwait that we worked on. There's refrigeration and HVAC on the bottom there. That image on there, that's actually a computer room where we did some cooling. And somebody told me before about justifying natural ventilation. Kevin was talking about this. And on that one, we know, for example, that it now takes 50% less power to cool that computer room than it did before. So we have a very real measure of effect out of that one. Airborne pollutants we mentioned in terms of their spread across the city. The cloudy image on the bottom, which doesn't look like a lot, but actually is we mapped 6,500 trees which were being planted around a new site which is being built in the States to see how the trees in various states of foliage would impact on natural ventilation at different times of the year. As a result of that, we actually remapped 6,500 trees and put them elsewhere so that they actually work better than it was in the first place. Smoke dispersion as well, because obviously on the same thing, natural ventilation, we need to import, especially with tall buildings, where smoke and fire is going to go. So that allows us to map that. This is a model actually of Kuwait City up here, same sort of thing. This actually I think was 15-kilometre radius, and again throwing some wind at it. So landscaping, we coupled internal, external studies and also master planning, as I mentioned before. So whether master planning is for new projects or new buildings going into existing landscapes.